Record. So welcome back to you and to all the people at home. I'm going to occasionally talk to this robot as if it's like another student in the class. Continuing our conversation about pre-Socratics. Today we're going to be talking about two more pre-Socratics, in addition to whom we've discussed already thus far. We're going to be talking about Xenophanes and Heraclitus. Remind me, though, who have we talked about already? I know that was like a whole weekend ago, and like our minds are sieves, and we've just like forgotten all that stuff. But catch me back up. First of all, let's start with the pre-Socratics. Why do we call them pre-Socratics? Yeah, because they're before Socrates. Good. Yeah, like pre-Socratic, right? Yeah, before Socrates. Which is, as we had noted, an unfair label to just like slap on a whole group of people that just happened to come before Socrates. But it's a relatively useful sort of historical term. We want to be a little bit more subtle, though, right? We don't want to just say, like, all the pre-Socratics, paint them all with one big, broad brush. We want to kind of identify there are little sub-movements within the pre-Socratics, and we discussed one of those. What was the first group of pre-Socratic philosophers that we talked about called, Eric? The Milesians. Yeah, and Susan, you had something similar? The Milesians, is that what you're going to say?
Yeah, I'm just going to say, like, Anaximander.
Yeah, he's one of the Milesians, right? How many are there? 3. Yeah, we usually talk about 3 Milesian philosophers. So the Milesians. And they were, who'd you say, Susan? Anaximander. Yeah. He's the one that comes to mind first for me sometimes because he's maybe the most interesting of those 3. Chronologically, though, he's the second of the 3, right? Yeah, go ahead and fill in the blanks there, Susan, for us. Thales, right. And who's the last one? Anaximenes. Yeah, good. Anaximenes. Excellent pronunciation as well. Well done. So yeah, Thales, Anaximander, Anaximenes all get lumped together. We call them the Milesians. Why do we call them the Milesians? Because they're before Socrates. No, right. Because they're from Miletus. Exactly. Yeah, they're from Miletus, a city in Asia Minor. Let's draw the map because I'm going to show us where the new guys are from as well. So first, the boot. And then the Adriatic Sea, and then Greece, and then the Peloponnese, and then up into Macedonia, and then the Dardanelles to here, and then eventually to the Black Sea. And then the coast of Asia Minor, the Ionian coast, that's where all these guys are from. Sometimes they get called the Ionian philosophers because they're all from over here. And then to Asia Minor and northern Africa up here. Miletus, where all the Milesians are from. We also mentioned that this is a pretty thin thread to tie 3 philosophers together, or proto-philosophers together with. What else groups them together as like potentially one big school besides their hometown? They all had principles. I would go so far as to say probably most philosophers are going to end up having principles, but they all had a certain sort. They all had one principle, one, and like a very particular. This word that we use, that principle can be used to interpret it. What is it? It's a Greek word. It starts with A and rhymes with parquet. Yes, Cameron. Arche, yeah, good. Right, so they're all like pointing towards some arche. One arche. A single arche. They're monists. This is what we usually say. They have one fundamental organizing principle. Let's get that term on the board because we'll come back to it over and over and over again. Arche, kind of a fundamental organizing principle. And all 3 of these fellows from Miletus are proposing one single arche. Thales says that single arche is the watery arche, yes. And Anaximenes says it's air. Anaximander says it's the apeiron, which is like a weirder concept and makes our eyes squint a little bit, makes us lean into the page just a little more, like, whoa, what are you talking about there, buddy? Harder to just dismiss, too, when you're just kind of like, that's not right. And you're like, wait a minute, how do you know it's not right if you don't know what he's talking about yet? Okay, granted, I'll have to look a little bit closer. in addition to them having one single arche, what's this other thing that we talked about? It's like we proposed that it's not just one thing. It's one, yeah, Thomas has, it's one material thing. And this is why these three fellows are sometimes, in addition to like us pointing out that they all come from Miletus, we'll sometimes refer to all three of them as material monists. Material because the arche that they're proposing there is matter, or some kind of material, right? And the devil's in the details for Anaximander there. And that's what your first reflection draft is about. Like, does he really fit in this group, or does he belong someplace else? But Thales and Anaximenes definitely seem to be proposing one thing that's a fundamental organizing principle of the universe, of the entire cosmos. It is one thing, so they are monists. And sure, Anaximander's a monist as well. And maybe all three of them, certainly two out of the three, are materialists to boot. In contradistinction to Pythagoras and the Pythagoreans, who are the other philosophers that we looked at. Let's put that in blue just to keep our colors all thematic. Pythagoras and the Pythagoreans, who are also coming from Ionia. Originally, Pythagoras born on a tiny little island just off the coast of Miletus called Samos. And because of people's intolerance for cults, Pythagoras and the Pythagoreans move all the way over here to Croton. This is the area usually associated with the development of Pythagorean philosophy. Far away from the Milesians. Perhaps we can kind of get some sense of like, yeah, it's got to be far away because we have a radically different approach to this question of what the fundamental organizing principle of the cosmos is. Instead of a material arche, the Pythagoreans are suggesting something else. What is it? Yeah, Cameron? Mathematical ratio. Yeah, mathematical ratio. Everything is water. Everything is the apeiron. Everything comes from and goes back to the apeiron. Everything is air. Everything is mathematical ratio. That's the fundamental organizing principle that's going to answer all of the why questions that we have about, like, why do things be the way they do? So yeah, we get this kind of abstract mathematical ratio. I'll go ahead and toss this word into the mix now so we can start getting used to it. Mathematical form. Not the material that undergirds everything, like fire or like water or air or the apeiron, but the form that material goes into, that it has a certain kind of proportion or ratio insofar as it becomes a thing. Bicycle? Gotta have two wheels, right? Otherwise, not a bicycle. That number 2 is like a big part of what makes bicycle a bicycle. If one wheel is like enormous and the other one is tiny, 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 it's a silly bicycle, right? Might not even be a rideable bicycle. Proportion is going to be essential to like what makes that bicycle do what it do and be what it be. Pythagoras and the Pythagoreans, different approach. Do we get how this is a different approach? Very different in flavor from the material monists? Such that we would say, like, yeah, you'd have to like be like on the other side of the Mediterranean to be talking that talk. What else did we learn about the Pythagoreans? Reincarnation, yeah. And all of this seems to kind of almost spin out of that turn towards mathematical, these abstract, formal aspects of mathematical ratio. Reincarnation, because if it's not matter that makes things what they are, then you can do whatever you want to the matter. You can destroy the matter, and perhaps the mathematical ratio, the form, the harmony or something like that might still be around. When we read Plato's Phaedo, we're going to read a Pythagorean in the conversation is going to put forth this idea that like maybe the body is like a harp and the soul is like a harmony that the harp plays. We'll come back to that idea eventually, but that's something that we might be thinking about now, right? Such that like once destroyed, it's not like the harmony gets destroyed necessarily. Maybe. We'll pick that up and really wrestle with it when we read Plato's Phaedo. But we can see how, like, yeah, that turn away from matter and towards abstract form, maybe it suggests something like, yeah, the soul doesn't die when the body dies, and then we're left wondering, so where does it go? I guess into another body, reincarnation. What else did we get? If we're not super impressed with bodies, then gender equality, right? Then if like bodies are like, bodies don't make a big difference, it's your immortal, immaterial soul, then like, maybe gender equality is going to look very different as well. And that idea of harmony, I think we talked a little bit about how it's not just mathematical descriptions about how things work, but suddenly this idea of like proportion and harmony seems to suggest ideas like justice and beauty and things like that. It's not just kind of like a cold, valueless description of the world. We have a description of the world that allows us to talk about like when things are working in harmony, when things are in discord, when things are the way they're supposed to be, when they're not the way that they're supposed to be. Questions about these folks just yet before we jump into the new stuff? All right. Oh, one more thing I want to get on the board over here before we jump into the new stuff is, at our last meeting we talked about this movement, this kind of like, if we think that philosophy is kind of coming into being here. And we're not sure, was Thales a philosopher? I don't know. Was Anaximander? Ooh, maybe. Was Pythagoras? Ooh, getting warmer. By the time we get to Heraclitus today, I'm going to suggest that like maybe we're there. Like I don't know when we got there, but I think by the time we get to Heraclitus, we're there. By the time we get to Parmenides, I think we're definitely there. But it's this movement from mythos to logos that seems to be describing this movement into philosophy, or this kind of birth of philosophical thinking, such that we might want to pretend to talk about these folks as the first philosophers. The first philosophers, like in the whole world, nobody else was a philosopher before this? But that's probably not true. Sure, plenty of philosophers before. But we are getting some sense of kind of like the beginnings of philosophical thought in one particular region and looking how it begins to come into being and take shape. This word, logos, is going to come back into the conversation today when we start talking about what it is that Heraclitus has to say about the logos. So, for today, we are talking about Xenophanes and Heraclitus. Xenophanes and Heraclitus and Pythagoras all get put together, and our readings that are posted online are taken for the Pre-Socratics at least, are taken from this Forrest Baird collection that I've got here. Baird groups Pythagoras, Xenophanes, and Heraclitus together in one big group. You probably saw it in the heading. They're like the three solitary figures or something like this, which seems also just kind of like a last-ditch effort. Like the Milesians, they all had something in common. And these three guys are three solitary figures. Like it's almost like there's nothing that binds them together. They came before Socrates, and they seem to be solitary figures. What about this guy? He formed a cult. Like, that's not so solitary. Like, okay, sure. Like, I don't know exactly what hangs all these guys together. But we have a conversation that's beginning here. We're going to start to see Xenophanes and Heraclitus, or perhaps us, reading Xenophanes and Heraclitus now after having had the discussion that we had before, building on the ideas that we started to put together in our previous conversation. Xenophanes and Heraclitus, also Ionian coast over here. Heraclitus from Ephesus, or Ephesus. You can still go there. The ruins are still there. Anybody ever been to the west coast of Turkey? You can still check out ruins in Ephesus. And Colophon is where Xenophanes is from. What's Xenophanes' big deal? Fire? Jumping ahead like a little bit of a bunny rabbit. That's the Heraclitus talk. But also, it seems like maybe it's the water, apeiron, air. How come nobody said fire yet? Fire is fucking dope, y'all. If anything's going to be the one thing that makes it's going to be fire. Yeah, we'll pick that up with Heraclitus for sure. Yeah, Gabriel.
Wasn't this he moved from the idea of many gods to one god?
Yeah, so the background theology, such as it exists for the Greeks at this time, is a polytheistic theology, right? We're roughly aware of this. There's a whole pantheon of gods. Yeah, Ivy.
That God was not like mortals, not in the image which the
Yeah.
were.
Yeah, so in this movement away from polytheism, we start saying something like, well, there's only, not polytheism, then it's going to be monotheism, right? Yeah. Yeah. I'm so Greek I can't even say it. Yeah, monotheism, and lots of stuff comes along for the ride there, right? It's not just like, there's one God, and like, wait a minute, what's it going to mean for there to only be one God? And is there going to be some stuff that just kind of like logically comes along with that idea? Xenophanes takes, I think, what it seems like a pretty interesting approach insofar as we can decipher an approach, because we're still only dealing with like a relatively small body of fragments that are attributed to Xenophanes in the first place. But the way that these fragments are organized for us by Baird and by others, we get this sense that maybe this begins from not so much just kind of stepping out and saying like, here, I'm going to tell you about God. The first move that we do is we say, how do people come up with the ideas of gods in the first place? There's a little bit of a metaphilosophical moment where there's kind of like this kind of attitude of criticism that says like, we have these ideas. Where do they come from? And do they come from someplace reliable? And if we can say no, then maybe that sends us on some other track. And the way that, like, it seems like the way that we come up with gods is not particularly reliable is, you mentioned it already. Anybody else want to kind of chime in and repeat?
Can you repeat the question?
How is it that so I was just saying, good, thanks. When we say that Xenophanes is first taking aim, or at least in the fragments that we have, first directs our attention to this problem with how it is that we come up with the ideas of gods. How do we come up with the ideas of gods, and what's so problematic about it? Yeah, Brian.
We create them in our own image, which is impossible.
Yeah, we invent gods in our own image. That's a little bit of phrasing that we might kind of like supply there, mostly because maybe some of us are theologically familiar with the idea of like humans being created in God's image. This would be the reverse, right? To create God in humans' images. And if you look at the Greek gods, and we say, like, those gods were created in the human image, we're like, what? Like, humans have wings on their feet? Like, no, none of that stuff. But, like, the pettiness, the having bodies, for example, the, like, traveling from atop Olympus down to, like, hang out with all of the humans, the having favorites, the having quarrels between them. In fact, the fact that there are many of them seems to suggest that like we're thinking about these gods as just kind of like pumped up human beings, superheroes more than theological beings in the proper sense. If you look at the Thracian gods, as we all know, people from Thrace, what are the Thracian gods like? They're like the Thracians. Red hair. That's what the Thracians are like. Yeah. When you see the Thracian gods have red hair. Surprise, surprise. And us in 2019 are like, oh, Thracians have red hair. Oh, got it. The African gods look like the African people. Darker skin. Facial features shaped a little bit differently than the Thracian gods. Xenophanes says, if cows and lions had gods, what kind of gods would they have? Cow gods and lion gods. Good thing we got past all of that, right? We don't think of like gods in human forms anymore. We don't create them in our own image. As we all know, like every image that we see of Jesus in a church, like that's what he looked like white, like fair hair, blue eyes, like that's Jesus. We don't create gods in our own image anymore. So yeah, that's a problem, right? To create gods in your own image. And as an antidote, we get this idea of like, if we're talking about like a god, if we're talking about a theological concept in such a way that it's maybe going to be able to play this game that everybody else is playing, some kind of arche, some kind of fundamental organizing principle for the entire cosmos. And stop for just a moment and see if like you can square your idea of God. Believe in God, don't believe in God, like I don't really care about that just at this moment. Let's get square on what the idea of God is in the first place before we say if we believe or disbelieve in that idea. But fundamental organizing principle for the whole universe? That seems like one way of answering that, like, why are things the way they are? Because of the gods. Except, instead of just being like, because of the gods, and they're fickle like humans, instead of that mythos kind of explanation, we have a little bit of theology, theos logos, right? A little bit of, like, logic applied to this idea of a god. And Xenophanes says, like, this won't do. If it is the arche, then we have one God. In addition to that oneness, some other things are gonna come along for the ride. There was a hand that I was steamrolling. Yeah, Cameron.
So when you ask
Well, if there's only one, then maybe we want big G.
Well, what's the difference between
And if, like, we're going to believe Xenophanes on this, we might even say, like, we might even want to adopt some kinds of, like, strategies to make sure that we're not oversimplifying what this is. We might even do something like that to be, like, super iconoclastic and be like, you can't even sum it all up in one word. Don't say the name. That sort of thing. Does that answer the question? That if we have many gods, then they're lowercase g gods. If it's like just the one. And what is it that we get all from this? Like one God, unchanging, unmoving. It moves everything else without moving. Xenophanes says God moves everything without himself moving. Maybe even himself is like too limiting. But like without himself moving, just through the activities of God's mind does God move things. Unchanging, unmoving. What else is in my notes? Whole. Not having parts, right? There's not like God's elbow and God's knee. Those are like different parts of God. God is like one whole thing, not something that breaks up into parts. This idea of like oneness and wholeness coming together. And that if something is one and whole, then it need not change. How could it change if it's one and whole? What would it change to? If this is some sort of supreme being, for example, Xenophanes isn't dropping words like perfection or like infinity in this conversation just yet, but we know that these sorts of ideas will tend to come along with theological ideas like one unchanging, unmoving, whole God. Then if God changed, what would God change to? Something different than a perfect being? That sounds like an imperfect being. If you're going to stay perfect, don't change. Don't move. Unchanging, unmoving, unbreakable into parts. Another big un. One more un. Different and important enough that I'll get a different colored marker for it. And you guys can, yeah, good move. That was the right move. Back to the text. There's another un. There aren't that many fragments here, right? It won't take you long to run through all of them. Incomprehensible, yeah. Unknowable was I was going to say, yeah, but incomprehensible. If you think you've got like God all figured out, guess what? You missed the idea, says Xenophanes. One God, unchanging, unmoving, whole, and unknowable. Which introduces some aspect like we haven't really quite seen just yet, that in this articulation of like God as this singular, whole, unchanging, unmoving, unknowable arche, we've introduced something, this won't go away. This will hang with us until the end of the semester. This idea of skepticism. That, yeah, perhaps there's a truth of this matter, but it's unknowable. If you think you know this, then like, no, you don't know this. As soon as you think you do have it, like that's exactly when you missed it. Gabriel, you've got like an I just ate a bug face that like is also, I think, something that's going on in my mind. What do you got?
But I remember at one point I was trying to scroll and find it, but wasn't there like a part of the text that he was even if like hypothetically like you did have the truth, like you wouldn't have like the ability to even back it up. So it's like not.
Yeah. No, this is fragment 11 in our reading. No man knows or ever will know the truth about the gods and about everything I speak of. For even if one chanced to say the complete truth, yet oneself knows it not. But seeming is wrought over all things. That's not the most graceful of sentences. Let me try that again. For even if one chanced to say the complete truth, yet oneself knows it not. But seeming is wrought over all things. Ooh, still, yeah, it wasn't a whole lot more graceful in the second pass. Even if you said the truth about God, you wouldn't know what you were saying. It's just too big of an idea for your finite mind. And that's God. That was easy. We saw something kind of like this when we were looking at Anaximander's apeiron, when we said, what's the apeiron? Can somebody please define the apeiron for me? What's the definition of the apeiron? That which is indefinite. Ugh. Tell me about God. What do you know about God? Well, I know that God is one, unchanging, unmoving, whole, and unknowable. That's what I know about unknowable, though, right? Does this actually work, or does he end up tripping over himself? Like, here's what we know about God. That one thing, God's unknowable. Like, oh, well, I don't need to hear anything more from you, Xenophanes. Like, shut up about everything else. Well, but there's more. God is one. God is unchanging. Like, no. You already said unknowable. Yeah.
Can knowing that he's unknowable, is that self-defeating?
Good question. Yeah, what do you think?
Kind of.
Does that count as knowing? Or am I being like too much of a stickler? Or are we going to say like, no, this isn't really all like that. It's not that weird and fancy. We can define something as like undefinable. We can say that something, I know that it is unknowable. Like I know that, I just don't know anything else, perhaps. But yeah, even then still, like we have some trouble. Like I don't know anything else except that God is unknowable. No, that's not true. You do. Unchanging, unmoving, whole, unified. Yeah, Anastasia. So there do exist, so let's be careful here. I don't want to say something like there do exist irrational ratios, because if they're ratios, then they're rational, right? But there are, there are irrational numbers, for example. That was the sort of thing, yeah, we mentioned this at our last meeting. I don't know if the online folks got this in the last video, but this there's a bit of apocryphal legend that the first Pythagorean who discovered that that for a right triangle with equal shorter sides, the long side is going to be the square root of 2 times the shorter sides, and that's not a rational number, and that's big trouble for the Pythagoreans. They didn't find a way to deal with that. They were like, oh, so the world is irrational. They just drowned that guy, as the legend goes, and said, like, we don't talk about that. You can't talk about it, right? Because it's irrational is like that's a Latin construction. Greeks would have said, instead of irrational, they would have said allogon. You can't talk about that which is not talk aboutable. Not clearly, at least. Is that what's going on here? You can't talk about God clearly, because God is not the sort of thing that can be talked clearly about. That's one way of doing it. Another way of doing it might be to say that, like, no. It's not that, like, the idea of God doesn't make any sense. It's that, like, there's something wrong with our puny mortal minds that can't read the kind of, like, the perfect infinite sense of a perfect, infinite, unchanging, unmoving being. Yeah?
That's sort of what I was asking. I mean, I'm remembering from but doesn't he say something along the lines of you can't know the whole truth about God?
That's right.
But
then again, God is whole, so I don't know if there are partial truths about God, because God is not a partial sort of thing, right?
But he has facets of God that he knows.
Facets of a whole thing with no parts?
Gems have facets.
Ships have facets?
I said gems.
Gems have facets? Gems have parts. Tops, bottoms, stuff like that. Left side, right side. God's not so much. Weird idea, right? Weird enough that I'm like, I don't know about you. I'm not like sending any 5-year-old kid to Sunday school to like learn about this weird idea just yet, because like I'm like, you're not ready. You are not ready for this idea. This idea is big. First, like, learn about mathematical infinity, and then come back and we'll talk about this other kind of infinity, maybe. Like, I don't know really quite what to say about it, but one of the things that Xenophanes reveals here is that like, this is a much stranger idea than we might first give it credit for. And it's deceptive because it seems so like ho-hum. You're like, oh, monotheism. Thanks, Xenophanes. Knew that already, by the way. He wasn't even first on the scene roughly in the region. Zoroaster beats him. Some Egyptians arguably get there first. Abraham is like maybe like somewhere in the neighborhood of, depending on who you ask, somewhere between like 500 and 1,000 years earlier than this. But he's working out the logic of this idea, which is one of the reasons why he's a compelling proto-philosopher. One of the reasons why we bring him into our conversation today is because we get to see this one idea play out some more, and we get to see that concept pop up. Unchanging, unmoving. That's not a new idea. That popped up when we were talking about the Milesians as well. That we were talking about something that's unchanging that underlies all of the change, right? This is why it's plausible when Thales says, it's like a little bit plausible. We understand his thought process when Thales says everything's made out of water, because we're thinking to ourselves, whatever that one thing is, it's got to be suitable to like change into other things, because the cosmos, as we see them, as like we understand them, as they appear to us, is just full of change. Everything's constantly changing in the world. So whatever that one thing is, it's going to have to be a changeable thing. But now we've kind of seen like, no, hold on. If it's going to be one thing, maybe it has to be an unchanging thing that moves other things without being moved itself. Change becomes a theme for us now, which gives us an excellent opportunity to transition to Heraclitus. With Heraclitus, we have way more fragments than we did for any of the other folks. And they're they're the sorts of things that, like, I think there's relatively good confidence that a lot of these are accurately attributable to Heraclitus. Not like he wrote them down exactly, like there's Heraclitus' notebook that somebody found. Because a lot of this stuff is coming generations later. But at least such that, like, there's just this way that Heraclitus turns a phrase is the sort of thing where it's just kind of like, as soon as you see it, you're like, oh, that's totally Heraclitus. Like, that's not the sort of thing that, like, with Thales, we get, like, Thales said that everything was made out of water. With Heraclitus, we get, what do we get? We get things like the path up and down is one and the same. Like fortune cookie shit. Like, this is, like, before when I said, at our last meeting when I said Anaximander, that idea of the apeiron is this thing that makes you kind of, like, lean in a little bit. It's an idea that, like, you can't really figure out what it is until you pick it up and play with it some. We've got the same sort of thing going on here with Xenophanes and this idea of God, a singular God at least, as opposed to, like, multiple gods created in humans' images. With Heraclitus, we get these weird little riddles that, like, you can pick these things up and play with them for days. And he's just got, like, one after another. Some of them are, like, I'll grant, they're, like, things that I'm just like, I don't really know what to do with that. Time is a child playing a game of drafts. The kingship is in the hands of a child. In the same river, we both step and do not step. We are and we are not. What? For the record, if you turn in shit like that for an assignment, I will not be happy. Heraclitus, sometimes called the obscure philosopher, the dark philosopher, sometimes dark because he is so obscure. It's tough to figure out, like, what is that guy even talking about? Speaks in riddles, seeming contradictions. But oftentimes those contradictions are the sorts of things where, like, the weirdness is what kind of grabs you and pulls you in. And we find that there's actually a feast there if you can kind of, like, pick it up and start to play with it. Like, oh, wow, that idea goes someplace really interesting. Sometimes not so much. And this is like that kind of, like, quasi-wisdom or pseudo-wisdom, or, like, it's when people mistake obscurity for wisdom, it's the sort of thing that, like, I don't know, you spend enough time in intro philosophy classes, you see it every now and again. Somebody raises their hand and says, like, but what is being? And, like, I'm thinking to myself, like, is that a serious question, or is that, like, are you just messing with me? Are you just, like, trying to appear intelligent and, like, say, well, what will we make of this? Or is this, like, do you have some kind of idea going on here? And it seems like more often than not, there's something going on in Heraclitus. It's weird. It's, like, difficult to figure out what to make of him. And for that reason, he's sometimes a polarizing figure. It's rumored, I think this is attributed to Diogenes Laertius in the 4th century AD, that when asked about Heraclitus, Socrates said, "Oh yeah, I've read Heraclitus. The parts that I understood were awesome. And the parts that I didn't understand, they were probably awesome as well. I don't know." And I kind of feel like that kind of sums up my attitude for Heraclitus as well. He did write one book, a book that, or at least it's rumored that he wrote a book called On Nature. That doesn't survive. I mention that because the next philosopher that we're going to look at, Parmenides, wrote a poem that did survive called On Nature. And so we'll get a look at that. But what we do have are like all of these fragments. I'm kind of curious, which ones jumped for you? Which were some of your favorite fragments from Heraclitus? Yeah, Garrett.
25.
Number 25, that's gonna like a... I like this. We'll just do philosophy like this. Number 20, I write number 25. Anybody else? Should we look at what number 25 is?
I don't have to.
Yeah, that's all right. Oh, that was Time as a Child. That was the one I just made fun of. Time as a Child playing a game of drafts?
No, one of them was about like killing some historical figures.
Oh, that's much later, yeah. 48. The Ephesians would do well to hang themselves. That's the other reason why he's sometimes called the dark philosopher, is that like he's a little bit of a misanthrope. You can tell he's a grumpy Gus. The Ephesians would do well to hang themselves, every adult man, and leave their city to the adolescents, since they expelled Hermodorus, the worthiest man among them, saying, "Let us not have even one worthy man, but if we do, let him go elsewhere and live among others." Silly Ephesians. They got rid of Hermodorus, however you'd like to pronounce it, who apparently was an awesome guy. They banished him. Was that the one that you were thinking of, Jared?
Yeah, like what are those about? Is he just like...
Well, apparently the Ephesians said that there was an excellent man in their midst, and maybe we might have to supply some stuff here. Like, why would they get rid of somebody who was such an excellent person? Why would they expel him from the city? Why would they banish him, ostracize him? Maybe he wasn't so excellent a person? What do you think? Is that what Heraclitus is saying here? The Ephesians would do well to hang themselves for appropriately recognizing that Hermodorus was not as excellent as people thought. No. No, it's the Ephesians messed it up, right? Hermodorus was an excellent person, but they thought he was not excellent when in fact he was excellent. Sometimes people don't like to have excellent people in their midst because it makes them look bad by comparison. So they're like, well, get that guy out of here. Maybe. Hard to tell. I don't know enough about Ephesian history. I don't know if anybody knows enough about Ephesian history to sort that one out. But it seems like somebody was ostracized. I'm supplying a lot of this because I'm kind of like projecting the story of Socrates onto this a little bit as well, who's like also somebody that like his whole city turns around and goes like, "You should die." And he's like, "But I'm trying to help you." And they're like, "No, die." And he's like, "Okay." That's kind of like the Cliff Notes version of the story of Socrates. So maybe that's the sort of thing that's going on here in fragment 48.
I just meant, like, what does that have to do with the rest of them? Like,
Oh, we don't know. Yeah, this is a thorough collection. Some of them are, like, good. And so that's why when I said, what are your favorites, I was kind of open for it. Like, maybe not the orphan ones. Maybe not the ones that were like, what's that doing? Yeah. Yeah, you can never step in the same river twice. Let's move to that because like changing and moving were a theme earlier, right? And now we're going to develop this a little bit more. In Plato's Cratylus, there's a character. So this is only a couple generations after Heraclitus. In Plato's Cratylus, there's a character who purports to believe in the teachings of Heraclitus and summarizes them thusly: that all things flow, panta re. That all is in flux. And sometimes we'll also point to this other fragment that you can't step in the same river twice. That fragment is so famous that we still say that. Maybe we doesn't include you. Like people today still say can't step in the same river twice. What do they mean when they say this? Can't step in the same river twice. Baloney. River. Me. Step. Step out. Step back in. There, I just did it. So, like, it's not like if I try, like somehow, like I'll freeze. Oh, I can't do it. Heraclitus was right. Like, no, what's preventing me from stepping in the same river twice? Different river. All things flow. Rivers flow. Step in the river once, step out. Go to step back in it. Ooh, different river. All the water that was in there before is now way downstream. Brand new water. Completely different river. Can't step in the same river twice. It's not the same, because it's not the same river both times. By the way, all things flow. All is in a state of flux or change. Not just rivers, not just water. Great handwriting, Rosenfeld. Come on. All things flow. All things are in a constant state of change. Not just rivers, including you. So if you're kind of curious, like, why can't I step in the same river twice? Oh, it's because it's a different river the second time. It's also a different you the second time. You can't do anything twice. Because from moment to moment, you've changed. If the river's a different river after it's flowed and changed, why not you be a different thing as you've flowed and changed? This is an interesting move. I'll point out that some of this is reading a bit into Heraclitus, and some of this is actually going to be in conflict with some of these other fragments. We'll kind of attend to that in just a second, because interpreting what it is that Heraclitus is talking about, sometimes it's just tough. I don't know what was going on with Hermodorus and the Ephesians. But some of this stuff I might be getting the sense, did you get the sense as you were reading, that these aren't unrelated fragments, that they're many of them are kind of related to one another, and they paint a full picture. All things flow. Can't step in the same river twice. I get what's going on there. And as before, when we were saying that we're picking one arche, maybe this is our arche. And it's a pretty abstract arche, as these abstract archi go. Heraclitus is saying, what's the fundamental organizing principle that tells us why the cosmos is the way that it is? It's change. The only constant is change. Heard that one before too? The only constant is change. Isn't that changing too? No. That one stays still. That things are always changing. Does that seem about right? Very different than this, right? That the arche of all of the cosmos is something singular and unmoving and unchanging. Here we're saying no, all things are constantly changing. Including God? I don't know. Heraclitus doesn't say much about God. But at least all the rest of the things, yeah. Who was it that said fire earlier? Christine. Did any of you guys get excited when you saw Heraclitus say that everything is fire, or all is in every living fire? Because you were thinking to yourself it's these guys, right? He's another one of these guys. It is tempting sometimes. Sometimes you'll see this on kind of really nerdy dorm room posters or something like that. That have all the philosophers and everything is, and for Heraclitus it's everything is fire. And it's tempting to sometimes think of Heraclitus as just another material monist. He just gets to a different of the natural elements instead of earth, wind, or fire. Nobody says earth, by the way. Poor earth gets left out. Yeah, but I don't think he's saying God is earth. Mostly because earth has parts, right? There's this part over here and this part over here, and God is whole. So move. All right, good. God's not the earth. But yeah, maybe Xenophanes says earth, everything comes from and goes back to the earth, so we have something. But would you agree with me that to classify Xenophanes as a material monist is to radically just take one thing that he said out of context and ignore all the rest? Same thing going on with Heraclitus. If you're he said fire, material monist, and he goes for fire, then I think we're just taking one thing that he said out of context and misinterpreting it. And we get an impoverished version of Heraclitus when we do that. But I do think we should look at this fire thing. And in fact, here, I'll even write it in red, and I'll make it on fire there. Because fire let's be honest, fire is cool. And for all of that stuff that we were saying before about water, because it's because everything that's alive requires water, and life happens when there's moistness. Everybody loves that word. And air. Did we mention like air as breath when we talked about Anaximenes? That maybe this is, if you're doing the whole like, the principle of life is going to be like the one arche for the entire cosmos. That like when Anaximenes says air, we might recognize that like, well, breath is air, and things that are alive breathe, at least I do. And so, yeah, that's the thing that moves everything. But fire isn't just like where life happens. Fire isn't just like something that living things do. Like fire is plausibly alive. Watch fire. It acts like an animal. It eats things, finds new things to eat, and it goes and eats those things. It moves, it changes, it's constantly dancing. Fire doesn't stand still. Have you ever seen a fire that's just like, you can take a picture of it, right? But it like freezes it. An actual fire is like always doing that. All things flow. Everything is constantly changing. This is maybe why fire is an excellent metaphor for the sort of thing that Heraclitus is talking about, that if we can think about fire, it gives us some clues into how we think about all things flowing and all things changing. For example, I just mentioned that like fire consumes, right? Fire consumes its fuel. Where does fire come from? It comes from wood. Fire needs wood in order to be a fire. Needs some kind of fuel, right? What happens to that fuel? When the fire burns, goes away, it gets destroyed, right? The fuel is destroyed in order for the fire to be. Everything that like allows the fire to come into being, the fire destroys in the process. We don't just have this process of change. What we have is a continual process of creation and destruction. Every change is a destruction of a prior state. I'm spitting. That's how excited I am about this. Every change is a destruction of a prior state and the coming into being of some new state. We saw something kind of like this with Anaxagoras when he was saying, like, according to the debt, that when something comes out of the apeiron, something is going to eventually have to go back in. All that comes into being must eventually someday be destroyed and pass out of being. With Heraclitus, we're getting this like idea that like every change, when we say that like can't step in the same river twice, when we're saying that like a change is a brand new thing being created, it also involves the destruction of that previous state. Perhaps this is why people fear change. They don't want to change because to do so would be to destroy your prior self. Do you think of this when you're all in school, presumably because you'd like to better yourself, which is like one way of changing? You can't better yourself without changing, right? Just like God can't change if God is perfect, because God would change to something that was like other than perfect. But if you want to improve yourself, you've got to change. That means you have to destroy yourself. Destroy who you are so that you can become who you will be. It's kind of bold, a little bit scary too. Fire flows, fire is constantly changing, and changes in such a way that it destroys in order to create. And it's constantly like destroy, create, destroy, create, destroy, create. That's what's going on in every single fire. And that's what's going on with every single change. This constant flow of creation and destruction from moment to moment. Every moment's a brand new thing. All of the other things, gone, destroyed. All of the new things, boom, created. Get some sense of how it is that this statement and this statement are talking about roughly the same thing? Blank stares. Good time to raise a hand. Bad time to raise a hand. I don't know what we're talking about. Oh, so raise your hand. Join the conversation. Let's toss a third set of... throw a third set of fragments into the mix here. The ones about war and strife and opposition. What is it that Heraclitus has to say about war and strife? Father of all things. Father or the king, depending on how you translate. Father or king of all things. War is the father of all things. Dark philosopher is right. Holy moly. But do you see how somebody thinks that like every single creation involves a destruction? Is also going to say something like, war is the father of all things. Strife is insofar as like anything does stick around insofar as like things stop moving and constantly like flowing and changing, insofar as that even appears to be the case, it's because things come into opposition with one another. I'm not saying that Heraclitus understood all of this, but like if you've taken a mechanics class, like a basic physics class, maybe learned about like normal forces and stuff like that like I'm standing here like not moving, not doing anything, so like nothing's really happening, but like no, tons is happening. My feet are exerting a force on the floor, the floor is exerting a force on my shoes, and then my shoes on my feet, and then my feet on my ankles, etc., etc., etc. There is like a war of electrons between the atoms in my shoe and the atoms in the floor that just like, on a micro scale, right where like apparently nothing's moving, it's just like, everything's just bouncing into one another. That's what creates calm and stasis, is when it's like, rah! On the small scale, but on the large scale, like everything's just hanging out. In order for you not to die, what do you got to do? You got to eat, which means you got to kill some stuff. And you're like, not me, I eat vegetables that you kill, right? Not personally. Somebody else kills them for me. Oh, good for you. War and strife, father of all things. Do we see like a picture that's kind of like coming into view here? And what's required for this is to keep going back through these fragments and kind of make connections and have little theories, but then also maybe check and see like, is there anything in this that maybe conflicts with other stuff that Heraclitus is saying? Do I have some idea of what Heraclitus is saying that, like, he comes right out and says, like, that's not what I'm saying the opposite of it here. Like, for example, it's very tempting, and as a matter of fact, like, I tend to read Heraclitus this way. I think one of the big things that's going on here is that he's giving us a picture of, like, what change looks like as a principle. What change looks like as this kind of conceptual problem for us to try to wrap our heads around. It's a difficult one to try to wrap our heads around, because as soon as you start saying something like, everything changes, which is the sort of thing that you could just like fire off carelessly in a conversation. The only constant is change, right? And everyone's like, yeah, right, okay. But like, what does that mean? That's like a crazy idea to say that everything is constantly changing, because it means that everything is constantly being created and destroyed. Whereas once there was just me and the river, like one me, one river. Now there are like billions of rivers as the river keeps flowing. Billions of me's as I keep changing. Plato's going to make a joke about this in Meno, where he says, like, stop making many out of one, as jokers say when somebody like breaks a vase. Like, this literally shatters the world. If you thought the world was like one big thing, like all of these other monists are saying, the world is one big thing. Heraclitus says, yeah, that thing is change. And if you play around with that idea long enough, you'll realize that this one big world just gets broken into a billion tiny little things that all exist for just a moment and are constantly being created and destroyed. That's what it means to commit to the idea of change as like the fundamental arche of the cosmos. That's a tempting reading. I'm going to push that reading even as like something that's the ghost of Heraclitus hanging around a lot of the stuff that Plato is doing in the later parts of this semester. But check out this fragment. Listening not to me but to the Logos, it is wise to agree that all things are one. Fragment 7. I was just saying that Heraclitus is telling us that like the one thing is actually like blown up into like an infinite many things. And then Heraclitus says, well, listen not to me, but to the Logos. There's our friend Logos. Don't listen to my words, listen to the Logos. And you'll recognize wisely that all is one. Well, shit, man, if all is one, then how come there's so many damn rivers? In the same river we both step and do not step. We are and we are not. What? What? For a second there, it seemed like, hold on, my theory of Heraclitus was contradicting Heraclitus. But now I say, like, Heraclitus is contradicting Heraclitus. Sometimes he just comes out and says it in, like, one big sentence. In the same river, we both step and do not step. We are and we are not. My ass, we are and we are not. Yeah, Ken.
Is this where some of the Buddhist philosophy comes from?
Well, no, it's not where some of the Buddhist philosophy comes from. There's some resonance with Buddhist philosophy, but there's not enough contact between. This is happening around the same time, though. I think that's maybe important to recognize that Siddhartha Gautama is like becoming enlightened and becoming the Buddha at roughly the same time as Confucius is doing his work, roughly the same time as like all these. There's like something in the air globally where like folks are just kind of like, let's do philosophy, and like everyone's like, yeah, sure, why not? But they're not actually in communication. There are some folks who will try to advance the idea that there is some little communication during these periods or later on, so that like it's not at the time Heraclitus and early Buddhists were talking to one another and kind of influencing one another, but maybe our interpretations of both traditions as they come to us now have kind of been read through mutual influence or something like that. That maybe seems a little bit plausible. So there's some crossover in the ideas, but I don't think there's any kind of case that could be made that like the Buddha read Heraclitus or even heard people talking about him. Or vice versa. So wait, where were we? Oh yeah, Heraclitus doesn't make any sense. Which maybe is appropriate, by the way. Yeah, Katie, are you going to help us make sense of Heraclitus, or are you going to jump on the he don't make sense bandwagon?
I feel like we're always changing, but we can't be two things at one time.
Okay.
One me, one river, and I might not be
At a time.
At a time.
Yeah. Right.
And then I change.
But from moment to moment, different me, different river.
Yeah.
Okay. So, but then
So there's not like a billion rivers at one time. There's a billion rivers over time.
over time.
Yeah.
So is that the sense in which into the same river we both step and do not step? I'm still having trouble with that one. But yeah, that's a noble try. What do the rest of you guys think about that? Is Katie rescuing it? Has she maybe not rescued it, but she's found a path to rescue it? It's like, here's Heraclitus' shoe. I think I'm on the trail, guys. I'd also like to suggest that like if everything is constantly changing, and today I say you can't step in the same river twice, tomorrow, if everything is constantly changing, maybe I say something completely different. Everything's changing, right? The river's changing, I'm changing. My mind is changing. Fickle human minds will like change from moment to moment. Everything is in flux after all, right? So if you remember, he said, listen not to me, but to the Logos. Maybe the Logos is unchanging? Everything's changing. Except the Logos? Or maybe the Logos is changing too. How crazy would that be if like logic itself was subject to this principle of flux and change? Suddenly this is starting to look a whole lot more skeptical too. We were saying like, listening not to me but to the Logos, it's wise to agree that all things are one. You know, that whole section on fragments about the Logos and the senses is just all kinds of like zany, rich stuff. Get right to you in a second, Garrett. Let me read one of these fragments. Of the Logos, which is, as I describe it, men always prove to be uncomprehending, both before they have heard it and once they have heard it. For although all things happen according to this Logos, men are like people of no experience, even when they experience such words and deeds as I explain, when I distinguish each according to its constitution and declare how it is. But the rest of men fail to notice, tickle in my throat, bad timing, on camera, no less. Oh man, that just came out of nowhere. Thomas, keep going for me, man. Fragment 5. Here, take this thing too.
I guess I'll just start over. Of the Logos, or Logos, however you say it, which is, as I describe it, men always prove to be uncomprehending, both before they have heard it and when once they have heard it. For although all things happen according to this Logos, men are like people of no experience, even when they experience such words and deeds as I explain, when I distinguish each thing according to its constitution and declare how it is, but the rest of men fail to notice what they do after they wake up, just as they forgot what they do when asleep.
Excellent. Thanks. Can I have the microphone back? All right. I'm back. Did we catch what was going on there? You can explain something to somebody and they're kind of like, yeah, they'll agree with you while you're talking, but as soon as you've left, have you had this experience, by the way? Have you had this experience this week? Have you had this experience maybe in the last hour in this classroom where, like, I'm talking and you're like, yeah. And then perhaps if I were to leave the room and someone was like, what was Rosenfeld talking about? You'd be like, I don't remember. Doesn't make sense anymore. Made sense when they were explaining it. Students say this all the time to me. Everything makes sense in class when you're explaining it, but when I'm by myself, it doesn't make sense anymore. I'm like, that's because you don't understand it yet, right? Makes sense for now. Or maybe, as Heraclitus is pointing out, that, like, human minds are subject to the flux that all things are subject to. You hold on to an idea for a little while. It's like when you dream. And when you wake up, you remember the dream, but then it fades away. And you don't remember it anymore. Unless you can write it down or tell somebody about it. Yeah, Thomas.
The one before it, it says, like, those awake have one ordered universe in common, but in sleep every man turns away to one of his own. Like, one of the questions in the reading quiz, which I asked you about earlier,
right.
That's what I was thinking about, but I couldn't really, put it into words.
Yeah, so that, was this the last question on the reading quiz? The last question, did anybody else have, like, a little bit of trouble with that last question? You were kind of, like, eventually you found the right answer? Maybe, no, not eventually?
See, I found it.
Yeah. If you had 4 tries, I bet you would have found it.
I found it. I was thinking that was the better option, like you were saying.
Yeah.
Just the other two, which was referencing that very first excerpt right there, it was saying it as if maybe it was something else that was, underlining.
Right. So we could interpret some of these fragments to mean some of the other, those other answer choices. And I'll invite us to do that right now. But there was one answer that was Heraclitus pretty clearly said exactly that. Yeah. If that's in those sorts of questions, go for the better answer. Go for the thing that's more clearly what he said. And if you start guessing and you're like, no, he says that, and I'm like, that's not the correct answer, one of two things is going on. Either there are multiple things that could be right, but one is more right than the others, and that's the one that I want you to zero in on, or it's always possible that I've miscoded the correct answers on this quiz. And if you're sitting there thinking to yourself, no, that is definitely the right answer, shoot me an email, and we can get that sorted out. But yeah, what fragment was that? Oh, 3, fragment 3 that Thomas is pointing out. Those who, and I would recommend, everybody who has the text right now, have it open to that section on Logos and the senses and be looking at all of those fragments as we're talking, because this is, for my money, this is one of the big puzzles that Heraclitus just kind of drops on us, which is what are we even to make of all of this shit that Heraclitus is saying? Is it the sort of thing where, one moment he'll say one thing and one moment he'll say the opposite thing, and, par for the course when everything's changing, I suppose? Or is this the sort of thing where we're expecting to see, one coherent, consistent theme throughout the whole corpus of the Heraclitean fragments? So yeah, Thomas directs us to fragment 3. Those awake have one ordered universe in common, but in sleep every man turns away to one of his own. That waking and sleeping is a metaphor, by the way, although we can think of it literally as well. That when we're awake, we're all in the same world, right? But when you dream, you go off to your own private, idiosyncratic world. Nobody else, I don't think so. Does anybody else get to experience your dreams? No team dreaming? Just yet? That would be cool. If like you can multiplayer video games and everything, but not exactly the same thing. Yeah.
Well, I just wanted to say that this was a time before they knew what.
Multiplayer video games?
Oh. No, I would say like what drugs can do to you.
Oh, this is not a time before they knew what drugs could do to you. They just didn't have exactly the same attitude. They knew, for example, that if you drank a bunch of wine, you would see and experience the world in a slightly different way. And in fact, Heraclitus has something to say about that too, right? He says, like, don't be drunk because you'll mess up things. And then he says, a dry soul is better than a wet soul. Maybe antithales, maybe a temperance, sort of a movement there. But in addition to that, like, they were eaten found mushrooms, and they were like, we'll see the Athenians, not the Athenians, in the oracle at Delphi, they just like plopped a young lady on top of like a gaseous vent where various vapors were coming up from down deep in the earth and intoxicating her and making her speak in tongues, and people would listen to what she said and take that as prophecy and then go run with it. They'd like launch wars on the basis of this sort of stuff. So like people knew about altered states. They just didn't have DARE programs. Those awake have one ordered universe in common. Fragment 4. The thinking faculty is common to all. 7. Listening not to me but to the Logos, it is wise to agree that all things are one. 6. Therefore it is necessary to follow the common, but although the Logos is common, the many live as though they had a private understanding. The Logos seems to grant some kind of like unified, insofar as like we stick to the Logos and make sense. We'll all speak roughly the same language. We'll find some agreement with one another. But if we abandon that, and each of us goes with our own private seemings, then many worlds, right? Or as if there's many worlds. The Logos is speaking to us, saying like, one. Everything is one, but we just don't hear it. Of the Logos, which is as I describe it, men always prove to be uncomprehending. Hold on a second. Men always prove to be uncomprehending of the Logos? The thinking faculty is common to all. Which is it, Heraclitus? Is it common to us all? Or are we all unhearing when it comes to the Logos? What's on the line here is this question of like, which version of this is going to like possibly, remember we introduced this skepticism idea with Xenophanes. That like, yeah, God is like one unchanging, whole, unmovable thing. And completely incomprehensible to your mind. And here we have Heraclitus saying like, listen to the Logos. And it'll show you how, like, all things are one. Or, go back to sleep and dream and let everything be many. Listening not to me, but to the Logos, you'll see that all things are one. But if you listen to me, by the way, when I speak, I'm going to say, all things flow, all things change. There's an infinite plurality of things. Who does that? Who says, like, here's what I'm going to say. By the way, don't listen to me. Listen to the exact opposite. Dark philosopher indeed. Pretty obscure. But lots of fun, right? Just, I don't know. I saw some faces just now. Fun. I would say a very different sort of an activity than we've done so far with any of these figures, because there are so many fragments and some potential inconsistencies in the fragments that we get to go through this exercise of trying to figure out, like, what is he saying? Is there a way that I can make it all knit together into one kind of coherent picture? And if not, what's going on there? Garrett and I were talking earlier today about, like, if you're ever reading a philosopher, particularly somebody who's, like, a fairly big name in the canon, and Heraclitus is definitely that, 2,500 years old, and, like, people are still writing dissertations. I saw 2 dissertations on Heraclitus when I was in graduate school. There's only like 50 fragments. Like, how much could you possibly write about this guy? But people manage to because it's so rich, right? Because like once you start picking it apart, it kind of starts coming to life all on its own. It drags you into the thinking process. Does so, though, at the expense of clarity. Possibly at the expense of coherence. But let's keep in mind that like one of the things that might be going on here is not that like, oh, Heraclitus died. I'll remember the idea. Let me finish it. If you're reading some of these figures, who are big name figures, people are still reading them to this day, and you're thinking to yourself, that's just dumb. That doesn't make any sense. You should at least start with the possibility entertained that you're just not understanding them properly. And Heraclitus leaves himself one big giant escape hatch in all of this stuff, all of the possible inconsistencies, with all of those fragments about the Logos, all of those confusing fragments about the Logos that suggest that like there's this kind of tense and indeterminate relationship between our minds and how we speak and the Logos, capital L, as if it's like some independent thing that is unchanging, maybe outside of the natural world, which does flow and change. How are we doing with these ideas? If you're thinking to yourself like, oh, I don't know, they're kind of confusing, I'd be like, all right, then you're in the right place. Like, it should be a little confusing. We're going to keep building on this stuff. Our next authors that we're going to read are the Eleatic monists. They will pop all the way back to the other side of Italy. And we're going to get somebody who's going to say, I was going to say, it says the exact opposite of what Heraclitus says, but Heraclitus says the exact opposite of what Heraclitus says. But somebody who kind of puts a sustained sort of effort into talking about what it would mean for things to not change at all, ever. Maybe something a little closer to what Xenophanes was talking about. That's going to be Parmenides' poem, Periphuseos, on nature. Have fun with it. I think it's the first time that we're encountering a relatively complete, it's not complete because there are pieces missing, but the poem is all from one poem, so it's like one unified text. That's the first time we're going to see that in this class. Enjoy your time till Thursday. I'll see you later.